Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Well, thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and today I'm here with our Extension Dairy Team colleagues, Dr. Gail Carpenter and Fred Hall. So on today's episode, we're going to recap discussions from a previous webinar that Gail presented on feeding high forage rations that yield high milk production. So welcome back to the podcast, Gail and Fred.
Always happy to be here, Jen.
Yep, and we're talking about one of our favorite topics too, so That's a good thing.
Yeah, we know that forages are a vital part of our dairy cow rations and also can be kind of a controversy, right? If we talk about different types of forages, how much we're feeding, what are the benefits and management practices that go along with that. So Gail, kind of to kick off our conversation today, in your webinar, we were talking about feeding higher forages. So why would producers consider, or why should we be considering feeding high forage diets?
Well, I think as we've seen feed prices increase so much recently and our input costs for milk production just keep climbing. We've seen a lot more interest from producers in feeding higher forage diets because this is something that they can control and they can produce themselves. So there's few things that are more cost effective than high quality for homegrown forages. They really do make the basis of a healthy rumen and a productive cow's ration. So I think we've seen a lot of interest in that recently, largely driven by this kind of desire to reduce our income over feed or maximize our income over feed cost by reducing feed costs.
You know, in the upper Midwest, as during the webinar, we talked a lot about corn silage. Sorghums, the high sugar male sterile sorghums are becoming popular in the area. So forage, sometimes we got to step back and see, okay, what does it look like where we live?
Yeah, that's very true. Forages are highly regional. And that's definitely something I get some after the webinar. I got some questions from people from around the country being like, oh, what could that look like for me? And what could that look like for me? And it's really hard to give a good answer to that question because it depends so much on your climate and the availability of forages where you're at. Your climate, your soils, your weather patterns. It varies so much from region to region. It's kind of like byproduct feeds. Byproduct feeds are not super consistent from one place to another. So we see in the Midwest, we see a lot of corn silage. We're a great place to grow corn and a great place to grow corn silage. So where we are in Iowa, that really makes, at least where I am in central Iowa, that really makes the basis for a lot of our dairy cow rations. But that might not look the same if you go down farther south or farther west. So it's really highly dependent on what is available to you.
But I think as we look at feeding forages, we've kind of seen a shift in milk production, right? It's not necessarily the volume of milk. We're looking at more of those component protein and fat because that's what we're getting paid on. So how do these forages help or benefit to, maximize those components?
Yeah, a lot of times when we're looking at higher components in our milk, and you're exactly right, we've kind of shifted as an industry away from that, not away from that fluid milk. Fluid milk's still important, but we've seen more of a shift as cheese intake has gone up in our in humans, in our population. We're seeing more people eating cheese. Our yogurts are more solid dairy products, and bread can speak more on that component production. And every time I get a question about increasing components, to me, it really boils down, unless you have a problem, unless you have something like really severe milk fat depression, or unless you have a problem with limiting amino acids, like a cow's not getting enough of a specific amino acid, unless you have like a true deficiency or a true milk fat depression issue, most of the time when it comes to increasing our component production, that really boils down to keeping that rumen happy. And a happy rumen is going to increase your component levels. So forages can play a really key part in that, because they will provide some of that buffering capacity to that rumen. They allow the cow to chew the cud a bit more, and provide that rumen mat, that forage mat in that rumen. So forages can be a really important part of making sure that that rumen stays healthy. Now, that doesn't mean that all forages are going to be effective in doing that. So there are a lot of caveats in that. So for example, we need to make sure that our particle size is right. If particle size is too fine, then you won't get any chewing from that. Cow won't chew that forage as much, and you won't get some of that buffering capacity. It'll just flow right through that rumen. But I do think that the ideal particle length is a little bit shorter than we've thought historically. We used to say as long as the particle length is shorter than the cow's nose, then she'll chew it. So we don't want it wider than her nose. We've kind of stuck with that like 4-inch particle size is as a good size for chewing. I think it's probably a little bit shorter than that. I think that cows can still get a lot of chewing out of as short as 1 inch. And they won't sort that as much. So particle size can be really important. But if you have a non-forage fiber source, for example, like a distiller's grains that is very high in NDF, that fiber is not effective. Or if you have hay that's ground way too fine, that fiber won't be effective either. So that forage that we're feeding needs to have the appropriate particle length. It also needs to be digestible, but that can be kind of a Goldilocks thing too. If the forage is not digestible enough, it's going to not digest in the rumen, and it's just going to make gut fill. So it's just going to not break down. It's going to fill up that rumen more and more and more. It's just like eating, you and I after a Thanksgiving dinner. She's going to feel stretched too full and not want to eat anymore. So we need to make sure that fiber's digestible in that forage. But at the same time, if it's too digestible, it can kind of go the other way too, especially when we're looking at corn silages and starches and corn silages. If that gets too digestible, we can have problems with wanting to slow down that passage rate a little bit too. So it really is not a one size fits all thing, and it's not just like we can say feed more forage and you're going to get more milk production, you're going to get a healthier rumen. We really need to pay attention to making sure that we have high quality forages, and that we are testing those forages so that we can use them the most effectively in our rations.
The identifying of your quality starts at the pile. When you're cutting corn, how important is it that we monitor what that forage cutter is bringing to the pile?
That's incredibly important. And I know that we've talked about this on some other podcasts and webinars, so I'd encourage our listeners to go check out some of those discussions that we've had for more details. But you cannot undervalue the importance of monitoring those forages when you're putting them up. Because especially if we're talking about something like corn silage, that is the basis of your ration for the entire year. Probably more than the entire year. Because we're trying to put up 14, 16 months of forages there, or corn silage there. So if you make a mistake, or if you kind of let things slide in August or September, whenever you're putting your corn silage up, that's an issue that you're going to have to deal with for the whole next year. So we really can't undervalue the importance of monitoring that chopper, monitoring kernel processing, making sure that our dry matters are right, making sure that our kernel processing is where it needs to be, because that's something that's going to pay off for the rest of the year.
And as I'm, looking outside, things are starting to green up finally after all this snow that we've had here the last couple of weeks. But, alfalfa season will be here before we know it, and peak season will be here. So that's just an important reminder as we're looking at that first cutting hay, to go out and check those fields for your field, to know, where you are for quality and cut appropriately to that. We'll be providing some resources once that starts coming out, or once, hay starts getting close to being measured. We can provide some resources on how to do that too.
time of year when it's really important. The hybrids we're wanting to plant for our corn silages, what we're and start looking at how our team is going to be working together over the next few months to make sure that all of our forages are being maximized in quality.
Well, Gail, I think we have a lot of details that we covered, probably not all the details that we covered in the webinar. So I'm going to encourage our listeners to go out to our YouTube channel. I'll include the link in our podcast here today on that webinar focused on feeding high forages, where they can get more details, listen in on the discussion that we had with some of our audience on that Q&A session. Any last comments as we wrap up our podcast here today?
Yeah, I just want to, one of the things we talked about in the webinar that I think is really important is that you can't really undervalue the importance of good management too. So you can have the best forages in the world and the best rations in the world, but if cows are overstocked, severely overstocked, or feed's not getting pushed up, or feed's not arriving on time, or your mixer isn't mixing correctly, all of those feed management things also really play a huge role as well. So just because our ration on paper and our forages on paper look like they're going to be rocket fuel and support that those high components and high component volume, that doesn't mean that the work is done. We still have to really focus on making sure that those cows are managed right and that our feed is managed right.
Thanks for joining us today, and look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.